Okay.
Hi, Chris.
Good morning, Stephanie. How are you?
I'm so happy to be home.
You were across the continent in an
I
entirely
was.
different country,
I
in
was
the mean streets of the United
of
States of America.
West Palm Beach.
Ooh, yeah. How was West Palm Beach?
I mean, like I go every year at this time for this event, but I actually never get to see West Palm Beach because it's always at this resort, like the PGA National Resort. And so, yeah, I don't get to see the a lot of the city. But I was on the airplane coming down here, and there was a guy who was an ex-boxer.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, I think he thought he was really funny or something, and he's going out for comedy now, but he kept telling me these jokes and I just couldn't get the punchline.
I mean, for you, it delivered well. It was delivered
Listen,
well. Yeah.
I'm tired. Okay?
um,
So
you
it's just
know,
you and I today.
yeah, just you and I. We we uh, we had our holiday get together last night, but our lawyer got sick. Really unfortunate that our lawyer was so sick. He was an illegal, illegal. I think mine's better than the punchline joke. I don't know. I really like my illegal joke. I'm sticking with I am doubling down on my illegal joke. Sick lawyer, illegal. Maybe it's better written. I don't know. I, your face says it all, Stephanie.
I have a question for you.
Yes, tell me.
What if most org charts are solving problems that you don't have? So Chris Roofer built Morningstar Company into a $700 million tomato processor with zero margins. Every employee
Hold on. What
negotiates
sort of company was he?
tomato. It's a
Please,
tomato
sorry.
processor. I mean, I love the niche bit. I love the niche.
Tomato processor.
I feel like I don't know. Sorry, it always like makes me wonder. Like, how did you get there? How did you end up a tomato? Like, did you actually endeavor to get into tomatoes,
Yeah,
or
like
was it an opportunity?
it's a
I don't.
lifelong dream to be a tomato processor.
But
Yeah.
the interesting thing is that the way they structure the company, every employee negotiates their own responsibilities directly with colleagues who depend on their output. So when Roofer needed structure, he designed for decision speed and not for reporting. Today on How to Founder, we're going to be talking about organizational design and when structure helps versus when it hurts. I'm your host, Stephanie Hayes. With me today is my wonderful co-host, Chris Franks, with the really bad dad jokes. Today we're doing something different. It's just us, just the two of us, with no guest. And we're going to dive deep into organizational structure ourselves. Now, this is interesting because you actually teach organizational design, right? And
I'm building a class right now for organizational design. Yeah.
There you go. And I do organizational design at a corporate level. And so we're going to have some pretty interesting things to talk about. But I think when we look at it from the perspective of a startup or a founder's perspective, I think that the really sort of interesting thing is when you apply the principles to a very, very small organization versus something much larger. So tell me about your experience with organizational design as a founder. Did you jump in and try to create something that was, reminiscent of a big corporate structure, or have you tried to be a little bit more agile along the way?
So I'll tell you how I've screwed it up first because it's always easier to talk about how I've gotten it wrong. I think it's a very common problem that we have as founders, which is we think of startups as just a mini version of the big corporate company that we left.
Mm-hmm.
And so we say, oh, well, there were departments and there were organizational charts and there were all these things that existed within this big company. And so the first thing I need to do as a startup is to create that same in a small company. The problem is it just doesn't work. There's not enough humans to do the work that is on your plate, much less the organizational, creating an organizational, some sort of a map or charter that creates this sense of order out of this chaos. It requires an entirely different set of thinking, in my opinion, on creating how you build a structure around a startup versus a big company. What about you? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, one of my businesses is all about building teams for high growth companies, right? And so these high growth companies are typically in that, like, I'm past the startup phase, but I'm not near corporate yet. And the reason that these structures come into corporate is because it's gotten to a point where it's hard to manage and it's hard to track and create performance in a more sort of ruddy structure. So in that sort of high growth phase, there's a point where people, the organization starts getting a little bit freaked out about people and managing people, and they try to put in these like big corporate HR management systems and structure, and it ends up actually costing the organization money and time and people, because the people who are there and what the organization needs at that stage in growth is a lot more nimble than these structures they're putting in place. And so they're causing people to, they're like, there's knowledge gaps, right? Like there's holes in and leaks in the transfer of knowledge, and the velocity of people moving through the system are so is so fast that you really can't use those more like big immovable structures. And so you end up with this I'm too early structure for what the actual organization needs. And it also comes down to how you build teams. And do you build teams around the hierarchy, or do you build teams around what the organization needs to run on? Like, rather than putting people together because there's a project manager and a something else and a something else. What if you define your teams as needing a connector and a commander and something else and a something else, and you build those profiles? So I think that there's a lot of conversation that still needs to be had around what organizational design looks like for smaller, more agile companies.
I think that at least for my mind, I think it would be valuable if we define what is organizational design. I think because organizational design, I think we typically think about it as big companies, which is how do you structure a big company to go after and attack the market. And classically, it's whether you organize as a field company or a central hub company, whether you organize by function, whether you organize by region, et cetera. But in your mind, just give me a definition of how you define organizational design, particularly for small companies.
Well, so if we start with a business model design, right, where we figure out how we're going to make money, right? What are we going to sell? How are we going to make money? That naturally leads into, well, what do we need to have in place in order to do that? But I also think, like, and so how do we build teams? How do we create connections amongst the teams? How do we create partnerships? Like, what is the structure of the organization have to look like in order to deliver on that vision or that business model? I think there's a perception that it's one and done as well. And I think an organizational design is an evolving, living, breathing thing that as we learn more about the organization or we bring new people into it, that the way that it structures has to change. And also, as our requirements or our goals from the company change, so does the organizational design. So that's kind of my interpretation of how we define it. And where are there gaps for you? Like where would you add to that?
I don't know that there's gaps. I think you got it correctly, but the way I just would probably say it a little bit differently. And I say it differently because my last company was an EOS company, and I believe a lot in the entrepreneurial operating system. And so the way that the entrepreneurial operating system works is you start by defining accountabilities. What does the organization need to do to be successful? So in your point, like if you're saying things like business model design, how do we do the job? And so Clayton Christensen, the late great Clayton Christensen, author and professor at Harvard Business School, used to talk about the job to be done. And so if you say to be done in each of these, or like what has to happen for us to be able to achieve and build a real business? Well, people have to get paid. People have to be able to be hired and fired. Okay, well, that's an HR function. That's just a job. It's an accountability. And so typically, I think where a lot of startups get this wrong, Stephanie, is we start with the humans that are in the room and don't start with the accountabilities. And so what I really like about the EOS function is you start with what are the accountabilities, and then you start to map who's going to be accountable for that. The second function, which I really love about that exercise, is that there's a saying, which is if nobody is in charge, or if everyone's in charge, no one's in charge. So you have to have a single person in charge, even if as a founding team, if there's two people, might be in 8 or 10 boxes. And that's okay at that stage. But somebody has to be in charge of that job, that accountability. Does that resonate with you?
Yeah, I mean, if you do a lot of reading around this stuff, things like
Stephanie, I'm from Texas. We don't do reading. We watch cartoons to get our information. I mean, that's really how us Texans do things.
So, I don't know if you've read Humanocracy or Holacracy or any of those, and they're like kind of interesting, and they're talking about organizational design from the perspective of the people, right? And align, like what you said around aligning around accountabilities, it's kind of the same idea. And I think that organizational design is very much about people and about how you string them together. And I think the concept of organizing around like departments is limiting, right? And so when a small organization, a small business start to adopt that mentality, now you're creating all of these little silos inside the organization, and people can't talk to each other, right? There's a really interesting thing called oh my goodness, it's the foundation of the business that I just built, and I can't get words in my head.
Here, both you and I are dragging a little bit today.
It's like mapping the network dependencies around around a little business, right? So when you start to do that, you can actually get these little tools that will go out and it'll crawl the business, and it'll show you based on emails and based on interactions and based on, it's almost like little deer trails inside of the organization, and you can see where people, it's like natural networks inside of an organization, and you can see where people are naturally connecting with each other. And I think that's something important to listen to look at and to listen to, because if there are natural sort of pathways between people in the organization, how can you leverage that and like do a little bit more with that rather than trying to impose a hierarchical structure? So I think the whole field of organizational design is like there's some good thinking out there right now, and it's the organizational dependency network, and it's starting to make this really people focused. And when you don't create your organizational design from a people's perspective, not like motherhood and apple pie kind of like, oh, I want to do so good for everybody, but just leaning into what sort of is naturally occurring inside the organization, then you force people into patterns that are not optimized.
I think
And I
you're
think
hitting on a principle here, and I think it's probably for most founders. I think that there's for we as us as founders, oftentimes when we start to think about this idea of organizational design, it feels like it's something that's in the future. It's like, oh, once I have 100 people or something like that. The reality is that founders do need to be thinking about this stuff early. And I think one of the principles is your organization, like your little company at 2 people, at 5 people, at 10 people, will start to create organizational pattern. The only
yeah.
question is whether or not it's intentional or unintentional. Are you actually mapping how you want your organization to communicate? What are the formal and informal communication structures that you have in place? What are the cultural components that you're trying to build? That will, it's going to happen. It's like famously they say your company has a culture. The only thing is whether or not you are determining the culture or it's for you. It's the same idea. If you're not very intentional about how you want your company to communicate, you'll start to get, even in small companies, lack of communication. You'll get territory battles. You'll get people that don't like each other, people that are not aligned, all those classic things that we think exist in bigger companies. But Stephanie, this is what you do. We see this all the time with smaller companies. It is an epidemic. As a matter of fact, like I've seen wildly dysfunctional companies. And if you throw scale, if you throw rapid growth on top of an organization that has not been well thought out, it starts to be incredibly dysfunctional, right?
Yeah. I mean, listen, your design is not about what other people do. Your design is about enabling the vision, right? And enabling the values that you have. So who you are as an organization is incredibly important to understand, because you need to build a design, like an operating design that actually fulfills your values and your vision and the goals. And so if one of the things that one of your values or one of your objectives is that, you know, I don't know, that the customer is always first. I'm coming up with stupid stuff right now, but customer's always first, and you build an organization that makes every interaction go through all of your people first. Like, what you build, how you build your organization is super, super important to align with what you're actually trying to build. And that can come down to not just values and vision, but also how you serve your customers and what you build in terms of product and offers too. So I think it all matters, and it's evolving. But there's some
I
pretty
think,
interesting thinking about that, right?
yeah, and I think you've hit on another principle. So if first principle is if you aren't thoughtful and intentional about your design, then it's just going to design itself and you're not going to like the outcome. I think that the second one is what are the foundational components? Well, we've already talked a lot on this show about core values and about how core values should help guide these decisions. But the secondary thing for me is defining what are the components of organizing a small business, even if it's 4, 5, 6 people. And I think you hit on a couple of the key points, which is formal and informal communication, I think, starts to become one of those really key components. Also, separating the fact that this is a structural component, not a leadership component. Leadership is about how you show up and whether you show up with service and about how you want to serve your employees. These are actual things that you write down to say, how am I going to build communication structures that allow my company to communicate well? Is that a fair way to say it? Like there's other components too, but I think communication, formal and informal, starts to become one of those components.
It's communication, it's workflow, it's even production and all of that, right? So you really have to be an architect of your business, and you have to start with the key pieces that are intangible, which are, what are we committing to, and what are we, wanting to build, and what's important about the way that we build it. And then you can, this is what we've kind of built, is this whole tool to say, okay, what are all those inputs? And then how do we create teams? How do we create workflows? How do we create processes? How do we create partnerships and structures inside the organization that are going to align with and deliver? Now, one of the problems is that there's all these sort of, fads that come about. And one of, in the technology world, we have seen like safe and safe agile and all of that sort of start to come about. And there's this concept that every organization should be flat hierarchy. Like that's something to, to strive towards. And it's really, really difficult to put in place. And so from a founding perspective, at the small business level, that tends to be one of the first places that you start, that everybody reports to the founder. And so from your perspective, where does that sort of break down, and when is that appropriate?
I mean, I think it's one of those things where you want to be the person that has 85 direct reports and you're fine and you know what's going on. Jensen at NVIDIA, I think he has like 150 direct reports or something like that. Like everybody in the organization rolls up to him. It's insane. I just think it would be a horrible life for you as the CEO or the founder. Imagine having all these people. If you consider the fact that being a manager is about solving problems, and every employee and every employee group is going to have problems, and you have 150 people or even 25 people where you're going to have to go solve their problems, I think it sounds like a miserable life, Stephanie. I don't know that I want to do that. I want to try to hire smart people that can make good decisions on behalf of the organization where I don't have to be involved. I would like to take a day off. I'd like to go to Orlando too, or Palm Beach, Stephanie. I want to go to the beach like you, hanging out, drinking
Listen,
pina
I
colada.
left you to the beach.
Oh, whatever. Oh, I'm at a conference.
I was
Sure.
on a PGA golf course in a conference room most of the day. Okay, just FYI.
Right.
And I found it very hot. It was very hot. But like that, it's a good. But like one of the organizations I was working with, which is a very, very large organization, and this guy had gotten pretty teed up about servant leadership and being flat hierarchy and all this sort of thing. And he created this organization, this group where he had like 300 people just reporting all directly to him. And obviously all of the things that happened that you would think would happen happened, and it became really frustrating as there was this huge bottleneck, and then nobody could make any decisions. And then your organizational design actually tells your employees what's important to you. So when you have this flat hierarchy, you've created a bottleneck, everybody just feels like, well, I can't make any decisions for myself. And so then you have this it's like a perpetuating cycle. You get people more dependent on you, and then they won't make decisions for themselves.
I think there's
really
2 points there, which is the first one is classically we tend to under-design organizations. Right?
Yeah.
And then there's the second fallacy, which is we create way too much structure and hierarchy for small companies. Like that's that fallacy of we're just trying to apply the same idea of a big company. We're just throwing it into a little company, right? It's like sometimes those are really hard balances to strike. How do you recommend that we do that?
Oh, well, I recommend that you understand what you're trying to achieve first, and then you build for that. But, to your point, when, NVIDIA has 150 people reporting into the CEO, that what matters there is the job architecture, right? The role architecture. And so do you put in place in that next layer down, are those people managers? I don't mean HR. I mean, like, are those managers that are meant to manage people or processes or both? Right? Like what?
It's a terrific question. And this is, I think, one of those really interesting things that we just get wrong in business isn't necessarily about organizational design, which is there is a fundamental difference between the art and science that is management, and then there's the art and science that is leadership. And leadership is this idea that you are trying to lead, you're trying to motivate, you're trying to inspire, you're trying to align. And management is about structures and control and organization. And it's like sometimes you'll put people into management roles that are really good at structure, control, and organization, and that are terrible in leadership. Or you get people like me that don't really like structure and control, but love the leadership component, love the human to human connection component. And I think that is really hard because finding people that are good at both, particularly early in companies, is really challenging.
Yeah, and I think like that's one of the fallacies that I think founders come across too is like, oh, don't I mean, listen, we both went through the .com, right? And in the .com it was kind of like, oh, everybody's just, all peers. Humans and in a workflow setting, you need someone to make decisions and you need somebody to like people need leaders and not everybody is a leader
Right.
for sure. And so there does need, I think it's less about structure and hierarchy, and it's more about um, what are the natural connections that we want to make inside of the organization, and who's in there that's going to who's in there that's going to follow, and build your structure around that. So there's so much that we could say around team design and what have you, but in a small business, you've got to be like with anything, you've got to be able to be very flexible and you've got to be able to keep evolving as you notice what's happening, right? So one more question for you, like your perspective on this. I think this happens a lot in small businesses is that we have a role that really needs to exist, but we can't afford to hire them yet. And so what do we do inside of an organization that where there's that gap, and we know that there's that gap, but we're not ready yet for that role? Do we promote within? Do we like layer that on someone else's job description? Like what would you do?
What I've done wrong first, again, because it's just way easier to do that, which is okay, if there's in our EOS world, we've created an accountability, we've created a job. Let's call it, I don't know, business development, let's say. And we know we need a business development person, but we don't really have the money and we don't quite know how we're going to do it yet or what that full responsibility is. How to do that wrong is to divide that role and responsibility up into 3 or 4 different people and layer that on top of other people's responsibility. And so that's a classic thing. If nobody is in charge, or if everybody's in charge of a accountability, nobody's in charge. And so what I would do, and I think that this is always, it's dangerous because, again, as a founder and as a CEO, you're busy and stressed. But I think that the founder has to be in that box, or the CEO has to be in that box until you're ready to hire it. And it's for one reason only. It's because you need to understand what that role is so you can hire it well. I'm not saying that every founder is going to be great at business development in this example. But I do think that you need to live in that role just long enough. Accountability. What is that job to be done? And so you can go out and truly find that. And to answer the question directly, Stephanie, who knows? Is that role in is that person in your company right now? Well, then go look around and see if you can find that person. And if not, then you have to hire from the outside and doing all the smart things about hiring for values, et cetera. That's my take. What's yours?
Yeah, I like, again, I keep, my organization is about very human focused design and moving away from this concept of roles and hierarchy and more into seeing how people naturally work, right? So there's my friend Kazia, she does something called positive impact mapping, which is super interesting. It's a little bit like ONA, like organizational network analysis, but it's more about energy. And so this is starting to get a little bit like even softer, but when you look at where things break down in businesses a lot, it's people connections, right? It's understanding roles, it's deciding on, the jobs to be done. And so positive impact mapping looks at like what's the energy flow, right? And how do people kind of what's the heartbeat of the organization as it is now? And then where do you need to make adjustments in the way that people are working with each other to be able to be in the right energy with each other, right? Like I'm a certain energy that's not a match for another person. And that affects the business, the work, that the jobs that need to be done. And so there's like there's a whole like positive psychology and, human side of all of organizational design that's starting to evolve. And it's pretty interesting stuff. Like Humanocracy is a good read to just, and Holacracy as well is a good read, just to start thinking differently about, hierarchy and structure. And I think that some of those concepts can work really well for small businesses as opposed for the big corporate entities, because it allows you to move a little bit more quickly and be a little bit more like, you need the most out of your people when you're that small, because every resource counts. And so hiring around roles, hire around something else that the organization needs.
Also, I think that both in bigger and smaller companies, we're starting to now understand the idea of the traditional siloed team structure or organizational structure just doesn't work. And so we know that things are changing so rapidly that we need to adapt, and organizations need to adapt. And I think it's why the team structure has started to be so important. And the idea that you may, as a human, like you may serve on 4 or 5 different teams at any given time.
Yeah.
And one of those teams may be the team that's planning the holiday party, and the other team might be deciding what our go-to-market strategy is. Another team might be how we're going to organize our budget. And that's completely acceptable. You don't necessarily need to force people in to these individual job functions. It really is about where people can plug in and be helpful and successful.
Yeah, totally agree. Okay, are you ready for the speed round?
Let's do it, Stephanie.
Okay. Do you think you can do it yourself?
I'll hit the speed round.
Okay. Prepare yourself. Get your fireman's hat on.
Yeah. I'm ready to go, Stephanie.
Okay. A high performer refuses to document their processes. Fire them before they become irreplaceable.
No, but do try to figure out what it is that they're doing. Do have somebody sit with them and try to document it.
Yeah, I'm dealing with this right now with a guy who wants to remain indispensable, so he refuses to share. Your best individual contributor wants to manage. The team will suffer without their output. What do?
You absolutely, if they're ready for that role, you have to promote them. Because even if you're going to lose productivity on the team, you're still gaining. That person is going to be growing and you'll be able to keep them.
I have a lot to say about that coming from the IT sector, but we'll leave it for now. Percentage of revenue should fund management overhead.
I think it's completely
$5 million ARR.
I think it's entirely arbitrary. And what you call management in that scenario, it could be a team leader. And again, if you're organizing in a more fluid team-based environment, a team leader can be somebody that is a contributor on another side. And you can then have that person be a team leader in some place and be on several other teams.
Yeah. So going down that rabbit hole, I think there's a challenge when management is seen as the next step, as the promotion with a very technical resource whose identity and skills are based on very technical work. And then they see their only path up is to manage people, and it just doesn't work. Okay. 2 co-founders disagree on a major decision. Tiebreaker is the CEO authority, board vote, or customer data.
Ultimately, I'm EOS guy. EOS is the CEO, the visionary has to make that decision. You can't push decisions up to the board level. Yes, data matters, but there has to be the person, and that's why that person is called CEO. Also, I'm CEO, so I get, I like that.
And then reorg every 18 months to prevent calcification. Agree or disagree?
Completely disagree. But I do see organizations that are in constant redesign. They're constantly like going from one organizational structure to the other. And well, chaos is not always bad in an organization. I think business likes stability. And the idea that you're constantly in reorg just feels chaotic. That being said, Stephanie, in scale up companies, that's what you get. You end up with, if you start with 5 people at the beginning of the year and you end up 50 at the end, you're getting a bunch throughout the year.
Yeah, and I think also we need to stay long enough in an organizational design to be able to understand if it works, but also be able to make shifts as soon as we know that it isn't. All right, deep dive resources, The Hard Things About Hard Things. It's a great book, Ben Horowitz, and Everyone Culture by Robert Keegan and Lisa Laplow-Lahey. That's a tongue twister. Yeah, any notes for us today? Anything that you came up with that really stuck out for you?
I think this is just one of those things that we don't talk about in the startup community. We talk about being great founders. We talk about even leadership, and we talk about management. The organizational design is one of those absolutely critical components that founders need to be thoughtful about. And just like culture, either you design your organization intentionally, or it will design itself unintentionally, and you can have a series of unintended consequences. And so I really think it's a great conversation. I've enjoyed it, Stephanie.
Yeah, I agree. And as somebody who's a proponent of organizational design, I think it matters a lot, but it's also important not to get stuck there. Okay. Thank you so much for listening. Please make sure to visit us on howtofounder.com, where you can connect with us on LinkedIn and subscribe to our YouTube, Apple Podcast, and Spotify channels. And remember, we believe that you are the pioneer of economic prosperity. Get the words out today. And we are so thankful to have you here listening to us. And we look forward to seeing you again on our next episode. Bye.